She just told you she's not ready for a relationship after 3 months of acting like your girlfriend. Your first instinct is to ask why. What happened in her past that makes commitment scary? What trauma created these trust issues? What can you do to help her work through whatever is blocking her from seeing what you have together? You dive deep into her history, analysing every story about her childhood, her previous relationships, her family dynamics. You become an amateur therapist, trying to decode the psychological origins of her reluctance to commit. You convince yourself that if you can just understand where this fear comes from, you can help her overcome it. 6 months later, you're still having the same conversations about her emotional unavailability, but now you have a PhD in her psychological background and zero progress toward the relationship you actually want. Today, I'm going to explain why your noble quest to understand women's problematic behaviours is actually the trap that keeps you stuck in situations that serve their comfort while destroying your sanity. Because understanding someone's dysfunction doesn't cure it, it just makes you an expert in tolerating it. Most men have been conditioned to believe that understanding is the pathway to resolution, that if you can just figure out why someone behaves in ways that hurt you, you can somehow transform that behaviour through empathy and patience. This belief creates an addiction to solving people, rather than evaluating whether they're worth your time. The understanding addiction manifests as an obsessive need to decode every behaviour, analyse every response, and trace every pattern back to its psychological origin. You become convinced that somewhere in her history lies the key that will unlock the version of her that can actually meet your relationship needs. This addiction keeps you trapped in situations that any rational observer would tell you to leave, because you're always hoping that your next breakthrough in understanding will finally produce the behavioural changes you've been waiting for. You mistake psychological insight for progress toward your actual goals. The addiction is particularly powerful because it makes you feel productive while keeping you stuck. You're always learning something new about her psychology, always discovering another layer of her complexity, always gaining deeper insight into her motivations. This feels like advancement when it's actually sophisticated procrastination. Understanding addiction also provides a socially acceptable reason to remain in dysfunctional situations. Instead of admitting that you're staying because you're afraid to be alone, or because you lack better options, you can frame your persistence as compassion, dedication, or emotional intelligence. The cruel irony is that the more you understand about why she can't give you what you need, the less likely you become to demand what you deserve. Understanding breeds tolerance for intolerable behaviour. Men approach relationship problems using a medical model that works for physical ailments, but fails catastrophically when applied to behavioural and emotional patterns. This model assumes that identifying the cause of a problem automatically leads to its resolution. When someone has cancer, doctors focus on treatment rather than spending months investigating why the cancer developed. The origin might be intellectually interesting, but it's irrelevant to the immediate task of addressing the existing condition. What matters is what can be done now to improve the situation. But in relationships, men become obsessed with the psychological archaeology of problematic behaviours. She's emotionally unavailable, so you investigate her attachment history. She's manipulative, so you research her childhood trauma. She's unreliable, so you analyse her previous relationships for clues about her trust issues. This medical model fallacy creates the illusion that psychological problems will automatically resolve once their origins are understood and processed. But behavioural patterns that have existed for years or decades don't disappear through insight alone. They require sustained effort and motivation to change. The fallacy also assumes that you can diagnose and treat someone else's psychological issues through your amateur analysis and patient support. This positions you as her unpaid therapist rather than her romantic partner, fundamentally altering the relationship dynamic. More importantly, the medical model approach ignores the crucial question of whether she's actually motivated to change the behaviours that are causing problems in your relationship. Understanding why she acts a certain way is irrelevant if she has no intention of acting differently. The understanding trap serves a hidden function. It allows both parties to avoid taking responsibility for the current situation by focusing on historical causes rather than present choices. This responsibility displacement keeps dysfunctional dynamics alive indefinitely. When you're busy understanding why she has trust issues, neither of you has to address the fact that she's choosing not to work on those trust issues. When you're analysing the origins of her emotional unavailability, you're not confronting her current decision to remain emotionally unavailable. The displacement also protects you from accepting responsibility for your choice to remain in a situation that doesn't meet your needs. Instead of acknowledging that you're accepting poor treatment because you lack better options or fear being alone, this mutual responsibility avoidance creates relationships that exist in perpetual therapy mode, where everything is always being processed and understood, but nothing is ever actually resolved or improved. You become experts in talking about problems rather than people committed to solving them. The displacement is particularly damaging because it prevents both parties from developing the accountability necessary for genuine change. She doesn't have to take responsibility for modifying problematic behaviours because you're always providing explanations for why those behaviours exist. You don't have to take responsibility for accepting inadequate treatment because you're always working to understand rather than working to improve your situation. Breaking this pattern requires shifting focus from why problems exist to what can be done about them now, and whether the person demonstrating problematic behaviours is genuinely committed to change or simply comfortable being understood without changing. The understanding obsession often masks a saviour complex where you unconsciously position yourself as the person who can heal her wounds, solve her problems, and transform her into the partner you need through your patient love and deep understanding. This saviour positioning is psychologically appealing because it makes you feel important, needed, and morally superior. You're not just dating her, you're helping her heal. You're not just tolerating her dysfunction, you're facilitating her growth. You're not just accepting poor treatment, you're providing therapeutic support. The saviour complex trap keeps you invested in relationships with fundamentally incompatible people because you're focused on their potential rather than their reality. You're dating who they could become rather than who they actually are, which sets up disappointment and frustration for both parties. This complex also prevents you from establishing appropriate boundaries, because setting limits on someone's problematic behaviour seems uncompassionate when you understand the psychological origins of that behaviour. Your empathy becomes a weapon used against your own well-being. The saviour trap is particularly dangerous because it attracts women who are more interested in being saved than in taking responsibility for their own healing. These women will provide just enough vulnerability and apparent progress to keep you invested while never actually making the changes necessary for healthy relationship functioning. Escaping the saviour complex requires accepting that you cannot heal other people, that understanding someone's wounds doesn't obligate you to tolerate their harmful behaviour, and that your role in relationships is to be a partner, not a therapist. Approaching dating like a job interview process provides a much clearer framework for making rational decisions about relationship compatibility than the therapeutic model most men unconsciously adopt. This reframe changes everything about how you evaluate potential partners. In employment, you don't spend months trying to understand why candidates have poor qualifications, lack necessary skills, or demonstrate problematic behaviours during interviews. You simply determine whether they meet your requirements and move on to better candidates if they don't. The employment framework focuses on what someone can provide now, rather than what they might be able to provide after extensive personal development. You're hiring for current capabilities, not future potential after therapy and growth. This approach also recognises that your time and energy are valuable resources that shouldn't be invested in people who aren't ready to provide what you need from the relationship. Just as businesses don't hire unqualified candidates out of sympathy for their circumstances, you shouldn't commit to relationships with people who can't meet your basic requirements. The employment framework eliminates the guilt associated with having standards because it's universally accepted that employers should be selective about who they hire. Applying this same selectivity to dating relationships becomes not just acceptable, but essential for your well-being. This reframe also helps you recognize that someone's inability to meet your relationship needs isn't necessarily their fault, but it's also not your responsibility to solve. You can acknowledge their struggles while making practical decisions about whether they're capable of being the partner you need. If you're starting to see how your attempts to understand and fix women's problematic behaviors have been keeping you trapped in relationships that serve their healing process rather than your happiness, subscribe and hit that notification bell. What I'm revealing today about the futility of therapeutic dating could save you years of frustration. One of the most destructive aspects of the understanding approach is how it creates unlimited timelines for change that keep you invested in situations that may never improve. When you focus on understanding rather than results, you lose track of reasonable expectations about when problematic behaviours should be resolved. The timing trap operates through the belief that deep psychological change takes time, and that pressuring someone for faster progress demonstrates lack of compassion or understanding of the healing process. This belief prevents you from setting reasonable deadlines for seeing actual improvement. Understanding her childhood trauma might explain her trust issues, but that explanation doesn't justify accepting those trust issues indefinitely, while she works through problems that should have been addressed years ago. Adults are responsible for managing their psychological issues within reasonable timeframes. The trap also prevents you from recognizing when someone is using their psychological history as an excuse to avoid taking responsibility for current behavior. Some people become attached to their victim narratives and resist change because healing would require giving up the secondary benefits of being damaged. Breaking the timing trap requires setting clear expectations about behavioral change and following through with consequences when those expectations aren't met within reasonable time frames. Your patience isn't unlimited, and your understanding doesn't obligate you to accept poor treatment indefinitely. The timing framework should focus on what changes you can observe in her behaviour, rather than what insights she's gained about herself through therapy or self-reflection. Insight without behavioural change is just expensive self-awareness that doesn't improve your relationship experience. Protecting yourself from the understanding trap requires developing an investment protection strategy that prevents you from becoming emotionally attached to someone before you've thoroughly evaluated their capacity to meet your relationship needs. This strategy involves treating early dating as an extended evaluation period where you're gathering information about her character, values, emotional stability, and relationship capabilities rather than building emotional attachment. You're researching, not bonding. Investment protection means maintaining emotional distance until you've seen consistent evidence of the qualities you require in a long-term partner. This distance isn't coldness. It's prudent evaluation that prevents premature emotional investment in incompatible people. The strategy also involves setting clear behavioural standards from the beginning and evaluating her response to those standards rather than trying to understand why she might struggle to meet them. You're testing for compatibility, not diagnosing psychological issues. Protection requires recognizing that your desire to understand problematic behaviors often stems from your premature emotional investment rather than genuine curiosity. When you've already decided you want to be with someone, you become motivated to find explanations that justify overlooking their obvious flaws. The investment protection strategy treats your emotional attachment as a valuable resource that should only be deployed after careful evaluation, rather than given freely to anyone who generates initial attraction or interest. The harsh truth about problematic behaviours in dating is that they usually indicate fundamental incompatibility rather than temporary obstacles that can be overcome through understanding and patience. People's core patterns are expressions of their character, not just symptoms of their history. Someone who is consistently unreliable, emotionally volatile, manipulative, or unavailable is demonstrating their current capacity for relationship rather than just revealing their psychological wounds. These patterns represent who they are now, not just who they became because of past experiences. Compatibility evaluation should focus on whether someone can currently provide what you need from a relationship, rather than whether they might be able to provide it after extensive personal work. You're dating them as they are, not as they could become with sufficient therapy and support. The compatibility framework eliminates the need to understand why someone can't meet your needs, because the origin of their limitations doesn't change the practical reality that your needs aren't being met. Whether their issues stem from trauma, family dynamics, or personality disorders is irrelevant to your relationship satisfaction. This approach also prevents you from falling into the trap of believing that your love, patience, and understanding can transform someone into the partner you need. Compatibility is discovered, not created through therapeutic intervention. Accepting incompatibility when you encounter it protects you from wasting months or years trying to solve problems that aren't your responsibility to solve and may not be solvable at all. One of the most sophisticated ways that problematic women maintain dysfunctional relationship dynamics is through the strategic use of their psychological history to exploit male empathy. They've learned that sharing their wounds and struggles creates protective barriers around their behaviour that make it difficult for men to hold them accountable. This exploitation works by transforming your natural masculine desire to protect and provide into a tool that prevents you from enforcing reasonable boundaries. Every time you consider addressing her problematic behaviour, her traumatic history is invoked as a reason why you should be more patient, more understanding, more willing to accept treatment that you would never tolerate from someone without a sob story. The system creates a psychological dynamic where her past becomes more important than your present experience. Her childhood wounds take precedence over your current emotional well-being. Her healing journey becomes more significant than your relationship satisfaction. This empathy exploitation is particularly effective with men who pride themselves on being sensitive, emotionally intelligent, and supportive partners. These positive masculine qualities are weaponized against your own interests by making you feel guilty for prioritizing your needs over her healing process. The exploitation also works by creating false urgency around her emotional needs, while treating your needs as less important or less pressing. Her triggers require immediate accommodation. Your frustrations can wait. Her therapeutic process demands patience. Your reasonable expectations are seen as pressure that could damage her progress. Women who engage in empathy exploitation often become skilled at timing their emotional revelations to coincide with moments when you're considering ending the relationship or setting firmer boundaries. Suddenly, new layers of trauma are revealed that require your continued support and understanding. The most insidious aspect of this system is how it makes you complicit in your own mistreatment by convincing you that tolerance of dysfunction is evidence of your moral character rather than evidence of your lack of self-respect. Men who fall into the understanding trap often develop what could be called diagnostic obsession, the compulsive need to categorize and explain every aspect of their partner's problematic behavior through psychological frameworks and therapeutic language. This obsession manifests as spending hours researching attachment styles, personality disorders, trauma responses, and therapeutic modalities that might explain why she behaves in ways that make the relationship difficult or unsatisfying. You become an amateur psychologist, not to help yourself, but to understand her. The diagnostic obsession provides the illusion of progress and control. Every new piece of psychological information feels like advancement towards solving the relationship puzzle. Every insight into her behavior patterns feels like movement toward resolution of your problems. But diagnostic knowledge without the power to create change is just sophisticated frustration. Knowing that her behavior patterns stem from abandonment issues doesn't stop those patterns from affecting your relationship. Understanding that her emotional volatility relates to her childhood doesn't make living with that volatility any less exhausting. The obsession also prevents you from making practical decisions about compatibility, because you're always hoping that your increased understanding will somehow lead to her increased functionality. You mistake learning about her problems for progress towards solving them. Diagnostic obsession is particularly dangerous because it makes you feel productive while keeping you stuck. You're always discovering new aspects of her psychology, always gaining deeper insights into her motivations, but these discoveries rarely translate into improved relationship experiences. The energy you spend on amateur diagnosis would be better invested in evaluating whether someone's current capacity for relationship matches your requirements rather than trying to understand why their capacity is limited. Another trap within the understanding framework is the belief that psychological healing follows predictable timelines, and that your patience and support can accelerate someone else's recovery from their issues. This illusion keeps men invested in relationships with dysfunctional women far longer than serves their interests. The timeline illusion operates through the assumption that progress is always happening, even when no visible improvements occur in the relationship dynamic. You're told that healing isn't linear, that setbacks are normal, and that your continued support is essential for her eventual recovery. This framework can keep you waiting indefinitely for improvements that may never materialize, because it doesn't account for the possibility that someone may not be motivated to change or may be more comfortable with their dysfunction than they are with the work required for healing. The illusion also ignores the reality that some psychological patterns are so deeply ingrained that changing them would require years of intensive therapeutic work that most people aren't willing to undertake. Your relationship becomes a casualty of their unwillingness to do difficult personal work. Recovery timeline illusions are particularly destructive when dealing with personality disorders, severe attachment issues, or deeply rooted behavioral patterns that have been present for decades. These conditions don't improve through understanding and support alone. They require professional intervention and sustained personal commitment to change. Protecting yourself from timeline illusions requires setting specific, measurable expectations for behavioural improvement and following through with relationship decisions when those improvements don't materialise within reasonable timeframes. Many problematic behaviours persist not because people don't understand their origins or lack therapeutic support, but because those behaviours provide secondary gains that make changing them unappealing despite their obvious costs. Understanding this dynamic prevents you from wasting time trying to solve problems that aren't actually problems from her perspective. Secondary gains from dysfunction might include avoiding responsibility through victim status, controlling others through emotional volatility, receiving special treatment due to psychological fragility, or maintaining attention and support through chronic crisis creation. For someone receiving these benefits, their problems are actually solutions to their deeper needs for control, attention, or avoidance of responsibility. This makes change threatening rather than appealing, because recovery would require giving up these benefits. The secondary gain problem explains why some people seem to resist getting better, despite having access to resources, support, and therapeutic interventions. They're not failing to heal, they're choosing not to heal because healing would eliminate advantages they've become dependent on. Understanding secondary gains helps you recognize when someone's psychological issues serve them too well for change to be likely. This recognition allows you to make practical decisions about relationship compatibility rather than continuing to invest in someone's recovery who isn't actually interested in recovering. The secondary gain framework also explains why your support and understanding might actually enable dysfunction rather than promoting healing. When someone receives relationship benefits for being psychologically problematic, those benefits reinforce the very patterns you're trying to help them overcome. The most effective way to avoid the understanding trap entirely is developing a self-selection strategy where you only become seriously involved with women who have already demonstrated the emotional maturity and psychological stability necessary for healthy relationships. Self-selection means setting clear standards about emotional regulation, communication skills, conflict resolution abilities, and personal responsibility that potential partners must demonstrate before you consider them for serious relationships. You're filtering for current capacity rather than future potential. This strategy requires patience and selectivity that most men aren't willing to exercise because it means turning down relationships with attractive but psychologically problematic women in favour of waiting for someone who meets your standards. The self-selection approach also involves developing your own attractiveness and options to the point where you can afford to be selective rather than feeling grateful for any female attention, regardless of its quality. This abundance is necessary for maintaining standards under pressure. Self-selection prevents the understanding trap because you never become emotionally invested in people who require extensive psychological work before they can be functional partners. You avoid the therapeutic relationship dynamic entirely by choosing partners who don't need therapy to be good partners. This strategy also protects you from the savior complex because you're not positioning yourself as someone who helps damaged women heal. You're positioning yourself as someone who chooses healthy women for partnership. The self-selection strategy may seem harsh or uncompassionate, but it actually serves everyone's interests better than the therapeutic approach because it encourages people to take responsibility for their own healing rather than expecting romantic partners to serve as unpaid therapists. Implementing clear boundaries early in relationships serves as an information gathering system that reveals someone's character more accurately than months of conversation and shared experiences. How someone responds to reasonable limits tells you everything you need to know about their relationship capacity. Boundaries function as character tests because they require the other person to demonstrate respect, self-control, and consideration for your needs rather than just their own. Someone who consistently violates boundaries or becomes angry when limits are set is revealing their approach to relationships more clearly than any psychological evaluation could. This information system eliminates the need for extensive understanding about why someone struggles with boundaries because their response to limits is more relevant than the historical origins of their boundary issues. You're evaluating current behaviour rather than past causes. Boundary testing also reveals whether someone is capable of prioritising relationship health over their immediate emotional impulses. People who can respect limits even when they don't like them demonstrate the self-regulation necessary for healthy long-term partnerships. The information gathered through boundary implementation allows you to make rational decisions about compatibility based on observable behavior rather than theoretical understanding of psychological dynamics. You're evaluating what someone does rather than analysing why they do it. Using boundaries as information systems protects you from the understanding trap, because you're focused on practical compatibility assessment rather than therapeutic intervention and support. The fundamental truth about trying to understand women's problematic behaviours is that understanding rarely leads to change, often prevents you from making rational decisions about compatibility, and usually serves their interests more than your own. Your noble desire to understand and support someone through their issues is being weaponized against your own well-being by keeping you invested in relationships that don't serve your needs. Understanding becomes a trap that prevents you from protecting yourself through appropriate standards and boundaries. The women worth being with are those who have already done the work to become capable partners, rather than those who need you to help them become capable partners through your therapeutic support and infinite patience. Your role in relationships is to be a partner, not a healer. Your responsibility is to evaluate whether someone can meet your needs, not to understand why they can't meet those needs. Your time is better invested in finding someone compatible than in trying to create compatibility where none exists. The men who escape the understanding trap are those who recognize that behavioral patterns are information about character rather than puzzles to be solved through analysis. They use that information to make decisions about compatibility rather than to develop treatment plans for others' psychological issues. Understanding why someone hurts you doesn't stop them from hurting you. Understanding why someone can't commit doesn't make them capable of commitment. Understanding why someone is emotionally unavailable doesn't make them emotionally available. The most attractive and successful men are those who evaluate people based on what they can provide rather than why they can't provide it, who set standards based on their needs rather than others' limitations, and who choose partners based on compatibility rather than potential for improvement. Share this analysis with any man who's exhausted from trying to understand his way into a functional relationship and needs to understand that compatibility is discovered through evaluation, not created through therapeutic intervention.